My name is Bridget Lane. I am 36 years old. I am employed by the Defense Intelligence Agency, though my role may not align with common perceptions. I'm not the one analyzing from behind the curtain. I'm not the interpreter you envision donning a headset at a conference. I am the shadow lurking in the corners of conversations, the name that goes unspoken in public forums, the face that remains hidden from view, my history locked away as if it were a closely guarded secret. They refer to me as Ghostwalker, and the sole reason you're aware of that name now is due to the fact that 6 words transformed everything. The event took place during a promotion ceremony at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. The room was populated by influential figures, contractors, and advisors, the sort of individuals who bore the weight of authority and an even greater weight of unspoken tension. Among them stood my father, Colonel Thomas Lane, now enjoying his retirement. It had been nearly 3 years since our last encounter, the moment he locked eyes with me and declared, "You're wasting your time with all these languages, Bridget." Mastering 9 languages doesn't transform you into a warrior. For years, he had ridiculed me. Every accolade I earned that didn't resemble a mark of precision was deemed insignificant in his perspective. He had faith in the tangible boots that carried weight bullets, that spoke of conflict, and the scars that told stories of battles fought and endured. When he received the invitation to the ceremony, under the impression it was meant for another, I chose to remain quiet. I positioned myself 3 rows back, clad in a simple uniform, devoid of stripes or ribbons, aiming to remain unnoticed. My name didn't make it onto the program. My image didn't make it onto the slides. That was deliberate. The announcer maintained an air of mystery during the introductions. Today, we honor an exceptional individual within the DIA whose remarkable efforts have actively averted international conflict across 5 theaters of operation. This dedicated professional has worked quietly behind the scenes and possesses fluency in 9 languages. At that moment, my father let out a scoff that echoed through the room, capturing the attention of nearly everyone present. "Knowing 9 languages won't turn you into a soldier," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. The man next to him let out a soft laugh. Another person adjusted their position, yet I remained still. I had grown accustomed to it. I had grown accustomed to fading into the background. Suddenly, the microphone on the main podium crackled to life, and an unexpected voice sliced through the atmosphere, distinct from the announcer's tone. No, this one had more layers, powerful, laden with conflict. It was General Latimer, the one who currently holds the reins of command over me. He moved ahead, leaving the folder untouched, his gaze not drifting to any notes. He gazed into the room, uttering 6 words. "We require Ghostwalker to be present in the room." Initially, there was a sense of uncertainty. A couple of gazes shifted. Soft murmurs began to emerge. Ghostwalker, as others glanced toward the hallway, anticipating an arrival, I remained 3 rows back. I stood up from my chair and moved into the aisle. Each footfall resonated in the silence. My father gradually pivoted in his chair, a frown creasing his brow. Then his eyes locked on mine. Recognition took longer than it should have. He blinked twice, then stood, not in anger, not in disbelief. He stood at attention because every officer in that room had already done the same. They knew the name Ghostwalker. I walked past my father. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. And when I reached the front of the room, the general simply nodded. No applause, no music, just silence. The kind of silence that comes after a shockwave. I turned toward the crowd. Some of them looked guilty. Some looked proud, but no one looked away. I looked back at my father. He was still standing, and for the first time in my life, he didn't have anything to say. My name is Bridget Lane, but to them, to the people who've read my classified files, to the men I've pulled out of enemy prisons, using nothing but dialect and intuition, to the ones who know what I've done without ever knowing my name, I am Ghostwalker. And my father just learned that, the same way the whole room did, with 6 words and a silence that finally said everything he never did. I grew up in a house where silence had weight, not peace, not calm silence that pressed against the walls like another presence. It wasn't the quiet of comfort, but the kind that warned you to tread lightly. My mother was sick for most of my childhood. Lupus. It took her energy first, then her appetite, then her voice. I was 8 when she stopped going outside, 9 when I started helping her wash her hair, 10 when I realized I'd already memorized every sound she made because they were the only soft ones left in the. My father, Thomas Lane, was a soldier long before he joined the army. That's how he carried himself. Like orders lived in his spine. He wasn't abusive, not with fists, not in ways people could point to. But he had a way of looking through you when you disappointed him. And silence was how he punished. We didn't have dinners together. Not really. He'd eat in uniform at the edge of the table, phone to one ear, boot on the other chair. If I brought him a report card, he skimmed for the math scores. If I mentioned I read something interesting, he said, "Is it from a field manual?" No. Then it didn't matter. By age 11, I'd built a small library under my bed. Old paperbacks from garage sales, cast-off dictionaries, a shortwave radio I found in a junk pile behind the fire station. It barely worked, crackled most nights. But when it caught something, I'd freeze heart-pounding trying to hold the signal. A weather report in Italian, a love song in German, a protest broadcast from somewhere in Eastern Europe. That radio was the first time I realized how big the world really was. And how many versions of the truth existed outside our four walls. I remember the first time I spoke a full sentence in French. I was 12. I had practiced it in my head for weeks. I found the truth in the words of others. I said it at breakfast, not loudly, just enough that he could hear. He looked up from his coffee, paused, and then said flatly, "That won't get you out of push-ups." I think he thought he was being clever. Then he added, "It's useless." That was his favorite word when it came to my interests. Languages, books, poetry, useless. What he meant was not tactical, not lethal, not battlefield proven. And in his world, if something couldn't win a war, it didn't matter. So I stopped speaking French out loud and learned Russian in my closet, Italian from a smuggled audio course on cassette, Arabic from a woman who worked at the laundromat and noticed I was reading labels on detergent bottles in 3 alphabets. She taught me how to say courage without using the word. At night, I'd line up phrases in my notebook like they were troops. Quiet, disciplined, waiting for orders no one would give. I never got grounded. I never got praised. Mostly I got ignored, unless I stepped out of line. Then the silence cracked into command. He was deployed often, and when he came back, the medals got shinier, and his standards got higher. His voice got louder. Mine got smaller. But I kept learning, not for him, for myself, because every phrase I mastered felt like a door he couldn't lock. By the time I turned 16, I could speak, read, and write in 5 languages. But at home, I still said yes, sir, and no, sir, and never said what I was really thinking. I used to dream that one day he'd overhear me speaking to someone in a language he didn't understand, and that he'd ask, "What did that mean?" And I'd say it means I am more than you ever saw. But that moment never came. Not then. And by the time it did, it wasn't me who had to explain what I was. It was my commander, and my father couldn't deny it because the whole room had already stood at attention. I got my acceptance letter on a Tuesday. It was thin government issue paper, sharp corners, thick ink. I held it in my hands like it might burn. Full scholarship, ROTC, linguistics. It wasn't just the money. It was a future I had carved out in secret, word by word, book by book, radio frequency by radio frequency. 4 years of university paid in full in exchange for service. It was everything I had worked for, and I had done it alone. I remember sitting at the kitchen table that night waiting for my father to come home. I had set the letter down where he usually placed his keys, hoping he'd read it before even taking off his boots. He walked in around 8:20, still in uniform, mud on his sleeves. He glanced at the envelope, picked it up, read the first line. Then he folded it in half and set it aside right next to the grocery list. No nod, no smile, just a low grunt. "Guess you'll be speaking 10 languages by the time you're done," he muttered. He opened the fridge, poured himself a glass of orange juice, and walked out of the room. That was it. No congratulations, no mention of how hard I had worked, no pride, no joy, just a man who couldn't see value in anything he didn't understand. The last time I had seen that look in his eyes, the one with weight behind it, was a year earlier. We were attending a retirement ceremony for his old commanding officer, At the end, they gave a special mention to one of the guests, the son of his best friend from the 75th Ranger Regiment. The kid was 19 and had already completed sniper certification with distinction. My father beamed. He turned to me and said, "Now that's a soldier." That line stayed with me not because it hurt, but because it confirmed what I had always known. His version of pride only came in certain shapes: rifles, medals, ranks, not books, not words, not me. Still, I packed my bags and left for university 3 months later. I chose a school 6 states away, far enough that he couldn't just show up, close enough that I couldn't quite call it running. ROTC wasn't easy, but I thrived in ways no one expected. I learned to shoot, to lead, to stay quiet when people underestimated me, which was often. And between field drills and obstacle courses, I studied phonetic syntax, regional dialects. I didn't just learn to speak, I learned to listen. I worked double shifts tutoring other cadets who struggled with foreign language requirements. I rewrote outdated training manuals into simplified language for humanitarian deployments. I even created a program that used accent variation to teach soldiers how to identify regional threats in the field. No one from home asked about it. No one called. Not even once. Sometimes when I walked back to my dorm from the library at midnight, I'd wonder if he even remembered where I was, if he still saw me as someone who chose a soft path. But then I'd think about that folded letter, the way he'd set it next to the grocery list like it was a coupon or a receipt. That was the moment I realized I would never earn his approval the way he wanted me to. So I stopped trying. Instead, I focused on becoming something else. Not louder, not tougher, just sharper, more precise. Like the words I loved cutting clean through even when unspoken. By the time I graduated, I had been offered 3 intelligence internships, 1 special clearance opportunity, and a quiet recommendation for the Defense Intelligence Agency. I accepted before the ink dried. No party, no photos, no posts on social media. I just sent 1 email home. The subject line said graduated. The message read, DIA starts in June. Hope you're well. He never replied. But I wasn't surprised, because in our house, the only thing louder than silence was disappointment. And I had finally decided it didn't belong to me. Not anymore. I started working for the DIA 2 weeks after graduation. There was no welcome banner, so onboarding video, just a badge I wasn't allowed to show anyone, and a series of rooms I wasn't allowed to talk about. They told me on day 1 this isn't a job. It's a silence you wear. I understood. I had already been wearing silence most of my life. My title was deliberately vague, Linguistic Field Support Specialist. But my work, it changed every 90 days. 1 month I was embedded with military police in Georgia, parsing coded chatter from extremist groups. The next, I was flown to Ukraine to cross-reference documents that had never existed, at least not officially. After that came Tunisia, then Syria, then 2 weeks locked inside A in Djibouti with nothing but a heat lamp, a radio, and 3 translators who refused to look me in the eye. No one ever called me by my name, not in the field, not in the reports. My name, Bridget Lane, was kept in a folder stored behind multiple layers of access. On paper, I didn't exist. I was listed as a support contractor, not military, not civilian, not assigned, just a ghost. That's how it works in the DIA. You don't leave fingerprints, you leave suggestions. At first, I was underestimated. A woman, young, soft voice. They'd hand me transcripts and assume I was just proofreading. But then I'd correct a misheard idiom that turned a vague threat into a precise attack plan. Or I'd catch the tone shift in an intercepted voice memo that signaled a shift in allegiance. They started to notice. And when they didn't, I didn't care. I didn't need credit. I needed to be right. But even when the mission succeeded, when operations were salvaged, lives protected, chaos averted, my name never showed up. Because people like me don't get medals. We get burned phones, unsigned memos, and one-line debriefings that say status contained. I remember sitting in a freezing tent outside Aleppo, translating a hostage negotiation that involved 6 dialects, 3 shell companies, and a man who once claimed he didn't need a translator until I proved he'd been tricked into selling weapons to the wrong militia. The soldier next to me, an intel officer from another branch, looked over and asked, You ever get tired of being invisible? I smiled. Invisibility is a weapon, I said. You just have to learn how to hold it without cutting yourself. He never asked again. Over 6 years, I became the person they sent in when no one else could figure it out. I didn't always carry a weapon, but I carried knowledge. And in rooms where no one shared a common language, that was the most dangerous thing you could bring. Still back at headquarters, I was known as the language girl. That's what they called me in passing. Not Ghost Walker, not even Bridget, just the girl with the notebook, the earpiece, the calm tone. A soldier once joked, "You're like a UN with legs." I laughed, because he didn't mean harm, but he didn't understand either. What I did wasn't translation. It was decoding people. Fear has a tone. Greed has a rhythm. Regret lives in the pauses. I didn't just hear words. I heard the gaps between them. Still, my name stayed locked away. And I was fine with that. Until I wasn't. Until one mission went wrong. Until someone leaked information they shouldn't have had. Until it became clear that the system I worked so hard to protect had cracks deep enough for ghosts to fall through. And I wasn't just a ghost anymore. I was a target. But that part hadn't come yet. Not in those first 6 years. Back then, I was just the quiet girl with the worn boots and the perfect memory. The one who never asked for recognition. The one whose father still thought she filed paperwork behind a desk. The one who every time she walked into a room made it just a little safer without anyone ever knowing why. The mission in Syria was supposed to be clean, quick coordination, low profile, limited exposure. I was embedded with a small unit outside Al-Hasaka, serving as a cultural liaison. The operation was humanitarian on the surface, meet with local intermediaries, secure medical logistics, and verify safe routes for civilian evacuation. But underneath it was something else entirely. There was a name, one asset, buried in layers of tribal negotiation, whose intelligence could compromise the financial web of an armed smuggling ring that had evaded tracking for years. We were close. Too close. Then the message came, a voice over our comms, in Arabic but not the local dialect. He asked for me by name, not my code name, my real name, Bridget. It sliced through the channel like glass. I froze. The soldier standing next to me, Staff Sergeant Keller, went pale. "How the hell would anyone out here know your name?" he asked. I didn't answer. The next 30 minutes unraveled fast. A roadside check-in turned into an ambush. 3 local informants vanished. Our safe house was compromised. We moved to fallback protocol, but it was too late. The unit's coordinates had been exposed. A sniper round grazed Keller's arm. He bled all over my scarf while I tried to keep pressure on the wound. And all I kept thinking was someone inside gave us away. When we finally got out airlifted to Erbil under blackout, I was met by 2 DIA officers with blank faces. They didn't say anything at first, just handed me a sealed folder and nodded toward a silent room. Inside was a transcript, a list of communications between the Washington field office and a clearance node in Langley. My name was highlighted in red. Not my code name, not an alias, my actual name. They said it could have been a coincidence, that maybe a third-party signal had been intercepted, that someone might have been posing as one of us, but they didn't believe that, and neither did I. The questions came hard. Had I communicated with anyone outside official channels? Had I spoken to anyone about the asset? Had I left my equipment unattended? I answered every question calmly, even the ones designed to shake me, but when they asked if I had any idea how the breach occurred, I told the truth. "I don't know," I said, "but it wasn't me." They didn't say I was lying. They didn't say anything. They just looked at each other, wrote something down, and ended the interview. After that, I was pulled from field duty. Temporarily, they said. Administrative reevaluation. It sounded cleaner than "we don't trust you." I was sent to a monitoring post in Germany. No operations, no assignments, just reports. Summaries of conversations I wasn't allowed to hear live. Translation without context. Analysis without meaning. It felt like exile. But I didn't fight it. Because something in me knew. This wasn't just fallout from a mission gone wrong. It was deliberate. Someone wanted me out. Someone knew enough to make it look like I was the leak. And someone thought I wouldn't notice. but they underestimated the one thing that had always kept me alive: pattern recognition. Not just in language, in behavior, in pressure points. The data didn't line up. The communication chain was too clean. The breach too specific. It wasn't a careless mistake. It was surgical. And if someone inside the system wanted to erase me, they'd need more than forged signals. They'd need to silence everything I knew, every voice I carried, every word I had learned to turn into pour. I could have reported it, gone up the chain. But I knew how this worked. Leakers get protected when they're well connected. Whistleblowers get buried when they're too quiet. So I waited. I watched. And in the stillness of that office in Stuttgart, I started building something new. Not a case file, not a complaint, a map. One that traced every signature, every timestamp, every anomaly. And when the time came when the right pair of eyes was watching, I'd make sure the silence broke. Not with noise, not with accusations, but with precision. Because if someone wanted me gone, they should have picked a girl who only spoke one language. They forgot I speak 9. And every single one knows how to say I'm not done yet. It had been 4 months since Syria. 4 months of silence packaged as protocol. 4 months of sitting behind a desk in Stuttgart watching data float past like ghost ships. No flags, no ports, no names. I told myself to be patient, that the system would clear me eventually, that facts would outlast whispers. But I knew better. Then the call came. I was 3 sips into a burnt cup of vending machine coffee when my secure line blinked. I wasn't expecting anyone. DIA field numbers don't just call unless something's wrong or very, very right. I answered without saying my name. Bridget. The voice was familiar, clean, clipped, a little surprised to still exist in my world. Evan, I said. Evan Ashby had worked with me back in Georgia long before Syria. We'd run a short operation tracking Farsi code switchers in black market arms negotiations. He was the kind of guy who memorized encryption schemes for fun and once cracked a Turkish smuggling ring because he recognized the pattern in how they used emojis. We hadn't spoken in over a year. Did I catch you at a bad time? He asked. I'm DIA in exile, I replied. Every time is a bad time. He gave a dry chuckle, then a pause. Listen, I didn't call just to say hi. I leaned back, eyes narrowing. He continued, I've been reviewing fragments from the Syria breach. You know, the ones they said were too corrupted for analysis. I nodded, though he couldn't see me. They weren't corrupted, just layered. He paused again. Layered, how structured, like something meant to look chaotic but wasn't. A pit formed in my stomach. What are you saying? I'm saying the sequence in that signature hash, the one tied to the signal that dropped your name, it wasn't random. It followed a proprietary cipher. Who's another silence longer this time? That's why I called you, Evan, said slowly. It matches the key design used in a contractor framework developed 6 years ago, Department of Defense Joint Encryption Licensing Project ALTO. My breath caught. I know that name, I said. Yeah, you should, Evan answered, because the lead signatory for that framework was Colonel Thomas Lane. The words didn't land all at once. They dropped one at a time, each heavier than the last. I stood up, heart suddenly pounding like it used to on extraction nights. No, there has to be a mistake, I said. My father was involved in ALTO, but he only signed oversight protocols, not system design. That's what I thought too, Evan said. But the document trails don't lie. He tapped something. I could hear keyboard strokes through the receiver. I just emailed you a sanitized trace check linked 47. I opened the file. There it was, clear as day. Lane Thomas H., authorization level C4, signature approval. Encryption lattice 12 Delta. He hadn't just seen the design, he had signed off on the encryption model itself, the same model used in the Syria breach. My mouth went dry. It doesn't prove anything, I whispered. Evan didn't answer. I sat down, hard, eyes locked on the screen. It could have been copied, I offered. Reverse engineered. It could have, Evan replied. But then there's this. Another email arrived. A metadata tag. Logged in the system 10 months ago, 3 months before Syria. Someone had accessed the ALTO framework from a legacy terminal. The IP address mapped to a location registered under a private consultancy firm based in Virginia. The listed executive contact, Thomas Lane. I didn't speak for a full minute, not because I couldn't, because if I did, I might scream. Evan finally said I'm not accusing him of anything, but someone used his credentials or wanted it to look like they did. And either way, I said my name was the one they burned. Exactly. I stared at the wall, my own reflection warped in the dark window glass. I had spent years building a life that couldn't be touched, and now the breach had a shape, a signature, a history, a face, my father's face. I ended the call with the thank you I didn't mean. Then I sat in the dark, hands clenched, breathing slowly. If he had done it, I needed proof. If someone else had used him, I needed the trail. But either way, one thing was now undeniable. I had been targeted from inside the house. After the call with Evan, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. My body was still, but my mind was moving like a machine stuck in overdrive. I spent the next 72 hours combing through digital archives that weren't supposed to be accessible. Retired contractor approvals, archived encryption logs, internal memos from procurement teams that hadn't existed in 5 years. I didn't use my DIA credentials. Too risky. I accessed through a dormant node once used for black market surveillance on Eastern European tech firms. An access point I had built myself back when I still thought the system could protect itself. The pattern came into focus faster than I expected. 6 documents, all tied to Project Alto or adjacent systems, all rubber stamped with the same authorizing signature. Lane Thomas H. Technical Policy Consultant, Level C4 clearance, temporary authority. I stared at the wording. Temporary authority. That wasn't standard. It meant someone had granted my father high-level clearance on an oversight. No audit trail. He didn't have to be on payroll. He didn't even have to be in the building. Just one email approval, one digital thumbprint. And suddenly my father had been in the room virtually when encryption models were approved and deployed. I dug deeper. There was one contract that stood out. Between the DIA and a vendor called Redshore Analytics, a shell company based in Reston, Virginia. At first glance, it looked like routine support data lattice replication and monitoring services. But the date caught my eye. Signed and finalized January 4th. The Syria breach occurred in March. Redshore Analytics had installed a secondary data lattice into the DIA's Middle East signal chain, a back channel, and the final approval on the contract, Thomas Lane. I felt it in my chest, sharp and electric, like my body was warning me before my brain could catch up. I pulled the PDF, opened the metadata. The document had been signed digitally, encrypted with a multi-point hash, almost impossible to forge, unless the signer had given someone their login or been in the room when it was forged. I ran a timestamp sync. The approval had come through at 02:13 a.m. from a terminal registered to a private consultancy space used by 3 other retired officers, one of whom had once served with my father in Kandahar. It wasn't a smoking gun, not yet, but it was more than smoke. It was ash. And if I was right, if my father had knowingly greenlit a contract that created the breach used to burn me, then this wasn't just sabotage. It was betrayal. I leaned back in my chair. My spine ached. The room felt colder than it was. I tried to imagine his voice explaining it. Maybe he'd say it was above board, that the contract was reviewed by someone else, that he didn't know what Redshore was really doing. Maybe he'd say it wasn't personal, but it was, because the breach had used my name. And whoever coordinated it had done so knowing I'd be in the field, knowing I'd take the fall. I stared at the signature line again. It wasn't just ink, it was intent. When I was 13, I forged my father's signature once to get out of gym class. He found out, made me run laps until I threw up, said a signature is a man's honor. You don't steal that. Now here I was, looking at his name, wondering if it still meant anything at all. I downloaded the files, encrypted them under a new code tree, saved them to a dead drop folder only one person had access to me. Then I sat in the dark, blinking against the glow of the screen, and whispered something I hadn't said aloud in years. Why, it wasn't a question for him. It was for myself. Because no matter what the evidence said, part of me still wanted to believe he wouldn't do this. But belief is a dangerous thing in intelligence. Belief gets people killed. Evidence is safer, colder, cleaner. And the evidence was starting to scream. The moment I had enough evidence to draw blood just short of a full accusation, I knew I couldn't go through official channels. Not directly, not as myself. The system had already marked me once. It wouldn't survive a second misstep. And I wasn't about to hand it another excuse to bury me. So I wrote a report, 8 pages, coded references, metadata from the Red Shore contract terminal logs, encryption matches from the Syria breach. Each footnote pointed to a consultant with level C4 clearance who had approved irregular encryption access under a legacy framework. I left the name out. Instead, I signed it with a temporary identity, one I had used years ago during a disinformation operation in Moldova. It still lived in a secure relay never deactivated. To the DIA, I was Alex Marsh External Systems Observer Tier 3 access. It was just enough clearance to sound real, just enough distance to make the report hard to ignore. I routed it through a narrow intel channel straight to Oversight Compliance Unit 3. OCU-3 handled internal irregularities and silent anomalies. They weren't investigators. They were cleaners, but they paid attention when whispers had teeth. 3 days later, someone bit. I received a response on the same secure node. Encrypted, high priority. The message read, patterns confirmed. Proceeding with quiet escalation. Source acknowledged. Containment protocol initiated. It was clean language. DIA, speak for we believe you. We're on it. Don't get in the way. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. They didn't want conversation. They wanted room to move. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched from a distance as internal traffic shifted. 3 senior contractors in logistics were placed on extended leave. Red Shore Analytics was flagged for retroactive audit, and a non-public invitation was issued for a ceremony at Fort Belvoir honoring select veterans and technical advisors for their contributions to long-term operational security. My father was one of the names on that list. I read the memo twice. It was short, polished, just enough detail to feel ceremonial, not strategic. But I knew better. This wasn't a thank you. It was bait. DIA doesn't like public confrontations. They don't expose people with press releases. They do it with pageantry-controlled environments, tight witness lists, security watching every blink. The plan was subtle, brutal, and beautiful. Invite the man who helped greenlight the breach. Place him in a room full of people who knew what really happened, and let him watch as the very name he tried to erase walked to the front of room and was saluted. They weren't just going to out me. They were going to make it unforgettable. I should have felt vindicated, but instead I felt cold, because now that it was real, there was no undoing it. They hadn't told me I'd be the centerpiece, but I knew. Who else could be the proof? Who else could stand there and look him in the eye? They gave me a 2-line notice. You are requested for formal recognition at the Belvoir ceremony. Standard protocol will apply. No public naming. That last part made me smile. No public naming. But everyone in that room would know exactly who I was and what I represented. I ironed my uniform for the first time in a year. No medals, no stripes, just the standard fabric, quiet, unadorned. Like me. The day before the ceremony, I received one final update through the Ghost channel. It was from OCU-3. Secondary targets confirmed. All observers will be present. Commander Latimer will initiate exposure. Maintain posture. Do not engage. I memorized it. Deleted it. Sat alone in my apartment and thought about how long I had waited for this moment. Not to be seen, but to be believed. I didn't know what my father would do when he saw me. I didn't know if he'd connect the breach to his own signature or if he already had. But I knew this. I wouldn't have to say a word. My presence would do what my voice never could, and in the silence that followed, the system would finally speak back. The room smelled like polished wood and regulation coffee. Soft conversation rippled beneath the low hum of fluorescent lights. There were medals pinned to jacket starch on every collar, and silence where sincerity used to live. Fort Belvoir's main hall looked like a place that had never witnessed doubt. But today, It was full of it. I arrived 15 minutes early as requested, escorted through a side entrance. My name wasn't on the program, not even my alias, just a silent check mark next to confirmed. They sat me in row 3, seat 4. No name tag, no unit designation. I wore my uniform, plain, no ribbons, no rank. To most people in that room, I was a quiet observer, one of many. Except not all of them thought that. I caught a few glances, subtle, quick, a flicker of recognition here, a narrowed gaze there, the kind of looks that said I've heard stories, but no one spoke to me, not directly. I didn't need them to, because I wasn't there to be greeted. I was there to be revealed. At exactly Oro 900, the ceremony began. An aide approached the podium, cleared his throat, and opened a small leather binder. Today, he began, we honor those whose contributions to long-range operational intelligence have made this country more secure, often without anyone knowing their names. A few heads nodded. The usual line, the usual room. I heard my father before I saw him. His voice still carried that same crisp edge like boots on tile. He was seated on the other side of the aisle up front in the VIP section. Polished shoes, perfect posture, uniform tailored to a man who never aged in his own mind. They announced him second. Colonel Thomas Lane, retired former technical advisor to the Joint Encryption Task Force Project ALTO. Applause, measured, respectful. He stood, nodded once, smug but not theatrical. He didn't see me, not yet. The ceremony moved fast, deliberately so. The names called were vague. Most were referred to only by initials or project numbers. One by one, they stepped forward, accepted a nod, then returned to their seats. Then came the pause. The binder closed. The aide stepped back. A new figure approached the podium. General Latimer. Tall, gravely voiced, war-worn face. He didn't smile. He looked out across the room like a man looking through fog searching for a target. When he spoke, his tone dropped half an octave. This next recognition is not ceremonial. It is corrective. We are here to acknowledge a contribution that has reshaped the landscape of modern intelligence gathering without recognition, without protection. And until recently, without a name, the room shifted, not loudly but noticeably. I felt the ripple. It passed through shoes and chairs and throats that had gone suddenly dry. My father leaned slightly forward. Latimer continued, "There is someone in this room who was marked once not for what they failed to do, but for what they did too well. Someone whose work has saved lives, destabilized enemy networks, and navigated more linguistic and cultural terrain than most of us could name." Then came the pause. You could feel the room lean in. He looked up, then he said it. "We need Ghostwalker in the room." 6 words, nothing else. But they landed like a siren no one had heard in years. There was no announcement, no spotlight, just silence. Then I stood. Row 3, seat 4. One movement, no hesitation. He didn't look at me first. My father, I mean. He looked left, then right, trying to locate the source. When I stepped into the aisle, he finally turned, and everything in his face went still. There was no anger, no confusion, just recognition. He didn't blink. He didn't move. Then slowly he stood, not ceremonially, not with pride, but like a man standing because he's no longer sure what else is real. I walked down the aisle, each step made quieter by the fact that no one else moved. No one whispered. No one clapped. I passed rows of decorated uniforms, pressed hands, fixed jaws. But no one met my eyes. They didn't need to. They already knew. I reached the podium. General Latimer stepped back. Didn't offer me the mic. He just nodded once. Respectful. Final. I returned the nod, then turned, faced the room. I didn't salute. I didn't speak. I just stood. And in that stillness, the only sound was fabric shifting as officers straightened in their seats, as heads dipped, as backs stiffened. Recognition doesn't always need ceremony. Sometimes it just needs time to finally catch up with truth. I looked at my father, still standing, still staring. His mouth opened just a little, but no words came. Because what do you say when the daughter you dismissed becomes the proof that you were wrong? He didn't sit down until I returned to my seat. And even then, he never looked away. 6 words had broken the script, but it was the silence after that told me he'd never be able to write another one. My father didn't leave the hall right after the ceremony. He didn't shake hands or join the post-event briefing with the other retirees. He just stood near the back exit under the insignia of the Intelligence Support Command, gripping his phone like it might anchor him to something he still understood. I watched from a distance. He wasn't pacing, wasn't angry. He looked disoriented, like a man whose compass had spun completely off axis. I could have walked up to him, could have said something, but I didn't. There's a silence more powerful than any accusation, and I had earned the right to use it. Instead, I waited. 5 minutes later, he finally moved slow and deliberate, like his boots were heavier than he remembered. He stepped outside to the edge of the lot where a flag snapped gently in the wind. That's where he made the call. I only know what was said because Evan, my contact at DIA, monitored that line, not because we distrusted him, but because a man like Thomas Lane doesn't change unless he's forced to face something undeniable. We needed to know how he'd carry the truth. He dialed a number labeled Charlie J. Old School, probably an old buddy from his deployment years. The line clicked, and my father didn't even wait for pleasantries. "Charlie," he said, "you ever hear of Ghostwalker?" There was a long pause on the other end, then the voice steady and flat. "No idea who she is, but I know one thing. If Ghostwalker was in the room, the mission lived." My father didn't reply immediately. He exhaled audibly, the kind of exhale that pulls something out of a man's chest without him knowing it. "Say that again," he asked. I said. Charlie repeated, "I don't know her name, but I know the code name. Every unit that's ever had Ghostwalker in the operation file came home." My father was quiet again, not out of confusion this time, out of realignment. I could imagine his mind racing backwards, trying to match whispers from years past unnamed successes coded reports. To me, Bridget, his daughter, the one he had once called useless with a map, the one who never fired a real weapon, the one who read foreign newspapers with a red pen and marked syntax patterns as if it mattered more than marksmanship, the one who never got a single clap in her own home. I don't know how long he stood out there, but by the time he hung up, the sun had started sinking behind the Virginia tree line. He didn't come back inside, didn't stop to speak with anyone else. He walked slowly to his car keys clenched in hand, but instead of starting the engine, he just sat there for a moment, staring out through the not at the road, not at the building, just into the dusk. And I stood inside near the double doors watching his silhouette behind the glass. It didn't look like victory. It didn't even look like regret. It looked like recalibration, like he was trying to rewrite an entire story he'd told himself for years that was about power, about value, about his legacy, and about me. I didn't need him to apologize. Not then. Maybe not ever. Because there are truths that don't demand an apology. They demand acknowledgement. And today he had no choice but to acknowledge me. The man who raised me to believe I was ordinary just learned in front of a room of officers that I had been anything but. He would drive home that night past the street signs we both knew, past the base where he used to be saluted, and into a house that never echoed with applause for his daughter, but now held the name Ghostwalker somewhere between its walls. He would pour himself a drink. He would sit in the chair he always sat in. But the room wouldn't feel the same, because silence has a shape, and mine had finally taken its place. And maybe, just maybe, when he turned on the evening news and heard about a near-miss operation intercepted in real time, he would pause, listen, and wonder if I'd been in the room. He wouldn't call, not yet, but I didn't need a phone call, because I had already spoken louder than any words ever could. My name was Bridget Lane, but to every commander who mattered, to every survivor of a mission that should have gone south, to every strategist who saw meaning in maps, codes, dialects, and silence, I was Ghostwalker. And now so was he, whether he liked it or not. They say the ceremony is where titles are given, but the lounge, that's where judgments are made. It wasn't long after I stepped off the stage, my name still echoing in a dozen minds, that I entered the officers' lounge with a paper cup of burnt coffee and a head full of silence. At first, no one said anything, the kind of silence that looks like respect but smells like evaluation. Then, just behind the tall vending machine near the back table, I heard the first whisper. Ghost Walker. For real, the voice snorted. She's a linguist. Sits at a desk not behind a trigger. Another joined in, lower pitched like he was pretending to be serious, but couldn't help the smirk. Maybe it's a new PR move. Slap a cool code name on the desk, analysts call it tactical branding. Laughter restrained. Not explosive. Not confident. The kind that needs company to survive. They didn't know I was there yet. Didn't know the walls carried more than sound. Didn't know that words spoken sideways still travel in straight lines. Another voice I heard, she's only been field deployed twice. Whole Syria file was redacted. Convenient? Huh? Convenient or classified, someone asked back. That one caught me off guard. It was quiet, measured, and I recognized the voice. It was Major Lawson. He had served in Tunisia when I translated a rebel code before it reached our convoy. He wasn't loud about it, didn't raise his voice, but silence cracked slightly around him. One of the others responded half-joking, classifieds, just a fancy word for unverifiable. And then a deeper voice. She's done more than most of you in this room. And she never bragged about it. The room shifted. It was subtle. A chair scraped the floor. A cup was set down too hard. Major Dawson, a logistics officer from Georgia. He'd read my reports. Once told me my analysis saved a $3 million equipment drop. Again, no one argued back directly. They just adjusted. Changed subjects. Moved on to talking about a new AI protocol being trialed in drone mapping. But the air had changed. No one said anything to my face. No one dared approach me with a joke or a jab, because people don't mock a shadow. And now they didn't know where my edges were. But mockery, I've learned, doesn't always wear a uniform. It comes dressed as doubt. It sneaks into the corners of conversation, not loud enough to confront, but sharp enough to bruise. As I stood by the window sipping my coffee, I could still hear it. Ghost Walker. Come on. Fluent in 9 languages. Not exactly firepower. She probably writes poetry in Farsi. I didn't flinch. Didn't correct them. Didn't explain how poetry in Farsi once disarmed a Taliban negotiator long enough for us to extract a wounded interpreter from an ambush zone. I didn't explain that 9 languages weren't for show. They were shields, swords, lifelines, and sometimes keys to doors no one else could see. Because here's what they didn't understand. Recognition, when it finally comes, doesn't silence the echoes of mockery. It just gives them a stage to embarrass themselves. I didn't want revenge. I didn't need their applause. What I needed, what I had always needed, was to hear them and to choose not to be small like they were. A captain walked past me, paused, and nodded. Then a younger officer, Second Lieutenant Ramirez, approached. He was nervous, held a folder too tight. I just wanted to say I read your analysis on the Baltic packet last year. It helped us crack a dead channel. I nodded. Didn't say much, just glad it helped. He lingered a second, then walked off. Not fast, not slow, the mockers noticed, and they hated it. Because when you mock someone who doesn't react, you expect them to shrink. But when others begin to notice, the silence isn't weakness, but control. That's when mockery starts to turn inward. I left the lounge, 10 minutes later, didn't look back. And outside in the corridor, I passed a junior analyst staring at my name on the announcement board. She didn't speak, but her eyes, they weren't mocking, they weren't doubting, they were curious, and that's all I needed. After the ceremony, I expected tension, but not absence. My father didn't approach me, didn't stay for the reception, didn't offer a handshake or even a nod. He left the building the moment the applause died down, head high, spine straight, as if pretending his world hadn't just shifted. For 3 days there was nothing. No text, no call, not even a word passed through family channels. And then on the 4th morning, I saw an email. No subject line, no signature, just a single attachment. A file labeled nothing. Empty, but for one sentence typed dead center on a blank white screen. If I sign a confession, will you go public? No greeting, no explanation, just that. For a moment, I didn't breathe. I stared at those words as if they were coded, encrypted, not in language, but in shame, in fear, in calculation. Because he knew. He had known perhaps even before the ceremony. Or maybe the moment he heard those 6 words. We need Ghostwalker in the room. He began putting the pieces together. He wasn't a stupid man. Thomas Lane had survived 3 combat tours and authored 2 military ethics manuals. But ethics are easier written than lived. I didn't reply immediately. I closed the file, walked away, sat on the floor of my apartment with my back against the refrigerator, and stared at the ceiling for nearly an hour. What he was asking, it wasn't about guilt. It was about control. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't offer clarity. He didn't even say sorry. He asked for containment. He asked whether I'd protect the legacy he still clung to like a fraying flag. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small in his shadow. I opened my laptop and replied with a single line, no. But I'm not the child's afraid of light anymore. I didn't say I'd expose him. I didn't say I wouldn't. I just stated the truth. The power dynamic had shifted. I no longer needed his name, his approval, his permission. I had become a force on my own terms, a name they whispered in black site debriefings. A silhouette in mission logs, too sensitive to publish. I had lived behind codes and clearance levels, but now I walked in full uniform with nothing left to prove. He didn't reply. Not that day, not the next, but I knew he read it. Because later that week, a quiet notification buzzed on my phone. An alert from an encrypted archive folder I'd forgotten was still synced to my home network. My father had access to file the original Syria deployment cipher, the one with his approval signature buried in the metadata. It didn't prove guilt, but it did prove awareness. And in silence, he confirmed what I'd always suspected. He hadn't sabotaged the system. He'd simply looked away when someone else did to protect a deal of position, or maybe just a comfortable retirement. Cowardice? Not corruption, but cowardice. Still leaves blood on the floor. That weekend I went home, not to visit, just to stand outside the house. It hadn't changed. Same cracked concrete path, same squeaky porch swing, same closed blinds even on a Sunday morning. I didn't knock. I didn't need another wordless room. Instead, I took out my phone, opened my notes app, and wrote one final message I never sent. You raised a daughter fluent in 9 languages, but you never learned the simplest one truth. I closed it, saved it under a locked folder labeled unsent. Then turned and walked back to the car. Because some things deserve to remain unsaid. But not because they don't matter. Because saying them wouldn't change who they are, and wouldn't change who I've become. 3 weeks after the ceremony, I got the notification. An encrypted message routed through DIA's internal relay, flagged as sensitive but non-operational. The subject line read, Confirmation Disciplinary Hearing. Case Internal Compromise, 647B. My breath caught. I tapped to open the file. Thomas Lane had presented himself voluntarily at a classified internal hearing. Not under investigation, but under personal disclosure. He walked into a secure conference room in Arlington uninvited and unsummoned, sat across from a table of ethics officers and intelligence auditors, and said 7 words I authorized a contractor I didn't vet. There was no flare of drama, no attempt to redirect blame. He admitted it plainly that 6 years ago, he fast-tracked an encryption contract because the firm was recommended by a fellow officer with political ties. He signed without full code analysis, didn't flag the anomalies, didn't notice the open back door in the transmission layer. Or maybe he did, but he didn't stop it. Either way, he accepted responsibility. He was asked if he knew who reported the breach. He looked them in the eye and said no, but I suspect I owe her everything. He never said my name. Not to them, not in writing, but in the transcript a line was underlined and flagged. I made a critical error. I accept all consequences, but I ask only one condition. Keep my daughter's name off every record. He could have denied it, could have gone silent, could have let the weight fall where it may. Instead, he drew a circle of protection, not over himself, but over me. That was the first real act of fatherhood I had ever seen from him. DIA accepted the statement. They redacted all peripheral names, sealed the file, and initiated quiet sanctions. Thomas Lane lost all consulting privileges. His security clearance was suspended. He returned his badges. He turned in his military advisory titles, but no press release was issued, no public notice. They let him walk out the side door quietly, finally, without applause or mockery. A week later, I received a small brown envelope in the mail, handwritten, no return address. Inside was a single object, his West Point pin, the one he never took off, not even during surgeries or international travel. The one I once tried to touch as a child and was told this is for soldiers, not for those who quit. He didn't include a note. He didn't need to. For the first time, his silence was an absence. It was acknowledgement. I held that pin in my palm for a long time, feeling its weight, its history, its quiet shift in meaning. It wasn't a gift. It was a gesture not of approval but of surrender. A passing of honor from a man who finally understood medals mean nothing without the courage to face your own failures. I never wore it. I keep it tucked inside a locked drawer next to the Syria report and the deployment cipher next to the unsigned confession I wrote, but never sent. Because legacy, I've learned, isn't about headlines or decorations. It's about what you do when no one claps, when no one watches, when the only applause comes from the truth settling inside your chest, quiet, permanent, and earned. They never said the word Ghostwalker again in my father's presence, not out of fear, but out of respect. And he never asked again if I'd go public, because he finally knew I didn't need to. The justice I wanted wasn't about destroying him. It was about proving I could stand beside him, not behind. That I could walk into a room and say my name, Bridget Lane, and still be seen. And for once in his life, he let that happen. The official letter arrived on a Tuesday. Top left corner, Department of Defense Intelligence Analysis Division. Top right, my name, Bridget Lane. The body was short, direct, clinical. Subject, voluntary reassignment. Field operations to strategic oversight status approved. Effective immediately. I signed the request myself, of course. No one forced me to step away from the field. There was no scandal attached to my name. No reprimand. No secret push behind the scenes. The truth was simpler than that. I had spent 11 years in rooms that didn't know my real name in missions where identity was as temporary as location. I had spoken 9 languages, but kept my voice quiet. I'd written entire escape protocols, rerouted convoys, redirected hostiles, all without stepping into the credit column once. I was a ghost and I was proud of it. But something shifted after that ceremony, not just in my father, but in me. I didn't need the shadows anymore. And so I asked for reassignment, the new role director of strategic language and cultural intelligence training. It didn't sound thrilling, didn't make headlines, didn't come with badges or covert operations, but it meant building the next generation, shaping minds, not just missions. It meant taking what I'd learned from the field, the missed cues, the dialect misfires, the cultural landmines, and making sure no one walked into those blind again. At DIA's Northern Virginia campus, my office had a real window. My badge had my real name, and for the first time I didn't flinch when someone used it in a hallway. I redesigned the training curriculum myself, structured modules around real-life extraction failures and miscommunication breakdowns, built live simulations, using audio from past operations with names redacted but truth preserved. I hired veterans who'd once been skeptics, linguists, who had never stepped foot in a war zone, tech officers with minds sharper than any blade. We worked as a unit, unseen but essential. We called it the Listening Lab because listening, I believed, was the first form of respect in any operation and the most overlooked. In the 3rd month of my new role, a junior recruit walked into my office. He was holding a printed briefing on my past field work. He'd gone digging beyond the standard clearance level. He sat hesitant. "Ma'am," he said, "are you really Ghostwalker?" I looked at him. You could tell he was waiting for denial or deflection. Some polite dodge, some bureaucratic shrug. Instead, I asked, "What did the name Ghostwalker mean to you before today?" He blinked. It meant whoever it was. They saved lives without needing to be seen. I nodded. "Then keep believing that." He smiled, stood, and saluted. I didn't return the salute, not out of disrespect, but because I'd never asked for it in the first place. Later that night, I found myself opening the locked drawer where my father's pen lay. I held it, briefly cool, solid, heavier, now that I understood its story. Then I tucked it beside a new item, a printed syllabus labeled Ghost Operative Linguistics 101, not for pride, but for continuity. Because stories like mine shouldn't vanish, they should evolve. I never saw my father again in uniform. He retired quietly, moved out west, spent his days rebuilding an old Cessna plane with a neighbor's kid. I heard from mutual connections that he never spoke of Ghostwalker, but he kept a file folder marked DIA Language Division tucked beside his military records at home. One day, I believe he'll tell that neighbor's kid a story, maybe not about me, maybe not by name, but something about what it means to serve without shouting, to admit failure without flinching, and to love someone without understanding them, until it's almost too late. And that's enough. I used to think the world was divided between applause and silence, that you either made noise or disappeared. But now I know better. There's a third place, a steady hum, where quiet impact lives, where stories aren't shouted, but passed along in small, true ways, like a pin in a drawer, or a name whispered in a training movement, or a voice steady and clear communicating in a way that resonates deeply with someone at last. That's where I reside now, not as a specter nor as a daughter seeking approval, but as Bridget Lane, an instructor, an architect, a survivor. Even without the shadows, I remain a traveler between realms. It was a Thursday when I entered the classroom for the first time, a stark contrast to field operations, mission briefings, or debriefs in a secure bunker illuminated by red lights and shrouded in code names. This felt unique. The corridor was illuminated with a bright light, its walls stripped of decorations save for a handful of frame maps and timelines that hinted at stories untold. The space was hushed, meticulously organized, yet brimming with possibilities. On the door was a small metal plate, unassuming and understated, with just 4 simple words etched into it: the Ghostwalker Room. I hesitated without any fanfare, no dramatic unveiling, and no one close by anticipating my response. Yet, a choice had been made by someone somewhere. To label a door, to recognize what had long remained unseen. I was unaware of who took that step, and I chose not to inquire. Instead, I let my fingers glide softly over the name, and smiled, not out of a need for recognition, nor because it mended every silence or every scar, but because for once it felt as if the universe responded in kind. This time, they noticed you. Within the room, 12 officers were arranged in orderly rows, majors, lieutenants, and a handful of commanders. They weren't students in the traditional sense. Rather, they were seasoned veterans seeking to learn a new way to communicate. On the whiteboard, I inscribed the title of our course, Strategic Intercultural Communication for High-Stakes Environments. Underneath, in a more subtle font comprehension, serves as a vital resource. Then I pivoted, gazed at them, and started to speak. I informed them that we wouldn't begin with phrases or grammar rules. We would begin with the most challenging aspect, the quiet that lingers between expressions the moment before a misunderstanding, the inhalation preceding a cultural faux pas, the point where purpose collides with presumption. I shared tales not my own at the beginning, but those I collected from every land my feet had traversed, instances where understanding faltered not from a lack of knowledge, but because someone overlooked the importance of truly hearing. Initially, they maintained a silence, but gradually, as the weeks unfolded, they began to draw closer. They inquired, they pushed boundaries, they expressed differing views with grace and consideration, and now and then I would catch a glimpse of fresh understanding blossoming in their expressions. One evening after class, as I gathered my files, a commander stayed behind, creating an unexpected moment of reflection. He inquired softly, "Did you truly serve under the name Ghostwalker?" I raised my gaze. He wasn't asking with admiration. It wasn't about idolizing someone. It was a blend of intrigue, admiration, and maybe an underlying inquiry waiting to be explored. "How do you bear that name without feeling overwhelmed by its weight?" I nodded, then added, "But the name holds less significance than the way you wield it." He smiled and walked away, leaving me standing there for a moment, allowing the silence to envelop me like an old comforting garment. That evening, I strolled home beneath a gentle drizzle, just enough to soften the edges of the city into a more tender scene. As I approached my door, I noticed a small box resting on the porch devoid of any return address or signature. Yet the script on the label struck a familiar chord within me. Within lay a photograph, worn yet preserved. There I was, just a 10-year-old perched on the floor with a worn book resting in my lap, my eyes wide as I absorbed the words, capturing a moment that felt so genuine, so unposed. Underneath a neatly folded sheet of paper typed and centered with care, "You once expressed a desire to transform the world through wisdom." Perhaps you did. No signature was required, and that was perfectly fine. My father had never found the words to express his pride in any of the languages I knew, but in this moment he conveyed it in the one that truly counted, the language of recognition. It took him a lifetime, and it took me nearly as long to understand that some people express their love in ways that go beyond words, in the spaces between silence, in fleeting glances, and in gestures that feel like delicate notes hidden away in soft, unassuming places. We never exchanged another word after that moment, yet it was sufficient, because the final message he ever sent me wasn't filled with information or uncertainty or another reminder of my shortcomings. It was an image of a girl who held the conviction that words had the power to change the world, and a father who at last allowed her to embrace that belief. I tacked it onto the corkboard next to my desk, not as a reminder of him, but as a reminder of the vow I made when I was that girl. That knowledge held value only when it contributed to deeper comprehension. The clarity devoid of compassion was merely clamor revealing that the most profound truths frequently communicate in silence. As we approach our farewell, we are eager to hear your thoughts. Where are you tuning in from? Is it a serene morning with a comforting cup of coffee, or a late night where tales like this wrap around you like a warm blanket? We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments, as we appreciate each and every one of you. If this story resonated with you, please think about subscribing to our channel. Not only to listen to more narratives like this, but to engage with the community that continues to embrace compassion, recovery, and new beginnings. We truly appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. No matter where life takes you, may this tale stay with you, reminding you that sometimes miracles don't come knocking at your door. It patiently lingers, waiting for the moment you decide to embrace your emotions. Wishing you well, and I look forward to our next tale together.